The critical component of compositions are the layers inside of them. Earlier, I drew the analogy between compositions being boxes of stuff. Well, if compositions are the boxes, then layers are the stuff. So we're going to take this movie here and basically get you a little bit more familiar with the concept of layers. So I've imported the snowflake file in Santa and the Robot, and I'm just going to drag Santa and the Robot to the new comp icon to make a composition that matches its properties. And I'm also, again, going to drag this snowflake on top of my Santa and the Robot video clip. Now, a key component of layers is what's called a stacking order. It's important to know that as you stack layers on top of each other, as they go toward the top of the stack, they obscure or cover up the view of those layers beneath them. So if I were to click on this snowflake layer and drag it and drop it below the Santa and the Robot video clip, we wouldn't see the snowflake. Because again, now that the snowflake is underneath the video layer, covers it up. Another important thing to know about layers is that this colored bar to the right of the layer represents the layer's duration, how long it's on for in your composition. Also, looking at these colored bars tells us when our layer comes on. Or for you video editors out there, it's in point. So if I were to click and drag on this clip and move it to the right, then what we'd have is this gap where just the Santa and the Robot clip would play. And then at this point, the snowflake would come on. Let's actually drag the snowflake on top. And let's preview this with the spacebar and see what I'm talking about here. Again, we're going to have about 17 frames, it looks like, of just Santa and the Robot, and then the snowflake will come on. There it is. We'll talk more about in and out points and cutting layers and all that kind of stuff when we talk about video editing a little later on. But I just wanted you to be aware of, for now, what these bars here on the right represent. Now, there are many different types of layers. There are your footage type layers with images or movies, audio clips, that type of thing. But if I right-click in a blank area of the timeline and go to New, you'll see that there are many other different types of layers. There's a text layer, and text layers are their own thing. So we wouldn't put text on the snowflake layer. The text would be its own layer if we wanted to do that. The text capabilities in After Effects are unparalleled, and we're going to devote an entire chapter just to creating and playing around with text a little bit later on. We could also create a solid. Now, a solid is just a blank layer of color. Nothing more or less than that. What we can do with solids will be apparent when we get to effects a little later on. If I were to click solid now, I could select a color for the solid, hit OK, and there's my solid. Now we could also resize this and use it as maybe a line somewhere or some other type of graphic element, but mostly what they're used for is effects. So I'll select that solid and hit delete. Go back to my right-click menu, New. And I want to talk briefly about shape layers. Shape layers are a new entity inside CS3, and to me, they're one of the most exciting parts of After Effects. It's almost like having a mini Illustrator now built into After Effects, and I just love me some Illustrator, so this really works for me. So I can create a new shape layer here, and we can select a shape and click, and there's a beautiful shape. And there's all sorts of parameters that we can animate and change, and all sorts of things that we can do to spice this shape layer up. Again, we'll talk about shape layers a little later on here. I'm going to select that and hit delete. Now, if I right-click and select New again, there are a few other types of layers here. Now, we're not going to be covering null objects in this training series, but null objects are essentially just null. They don't exist. They're objects that are used as controllers for other objects. Sounds simple, right? Well, actually, it is really simple, but what you can do with them is very complex. Now, there are also lights and cameras. We'll hit on these a little bit when we get to 3D because that's really when we use lights and cameras. These objects work and live in 3D space. So as you can see, layers are a very powerful part of working in After Effects. Now, once you have a bunch of layers in your composition here, it can get a little cluttered. So in the next movie, we're going to talk about how to arrange, or in other words, align and distribute objects visually in our compositions. That's next.